Billy the Kid, the sandy-haired, slim, blue-eyed, 5'8" sombrero wearer, charming and polite at one moment, but outraged and violent at the next, supposed killer of 21 men, each one for each year of his life. Oh, Billy the Kid. Some love him, some hate him, some don't know who the he is. But if you're the latter, you're in luck, because in this episode of my new series, Badasses, Bastards, and the Mildly Interesting, I shall be diving into the Western legend. Who was he? Why was he? What was he? When was he? Where was he? How was he? By Jove, I am rambling! Intro's over. On September 17th or November 23rd, 1859, Henry McCarthy was born.
Alias William Antrim, also known as William H. Bonney.
Whoa. William H. Bonney?
Alias Billy the Kid.
Given his parents' Irish Catholic ancestry, it would be almost preposterous to think at the time that this man would come to be linked to 9 murders, 4 of which he was responsible for, the other 5 he merely played a role in. None of this is to mention his future involvement in New Mexico's Lincoln County War. Henry McCarthy was born to Patrick and Catherine McCarthy. His exact date of birth is a subject of dispute among historians, but according to census, his brother Joseph was born in 1863 when Henry would have been around 3 years old. After the death of Henry's father, the McCarthy family moved to Indianapolis, Indiana. It was here where Catherine would meet her future husband, William Henry Harrison Antrim. That is the name of him, it's not just the name of 4 different men. In 1870, the McCarthy family moved to Antrim, Kansas, and a few years later they moved to Santa Fe in New Mexico territory. On the 1st of March, 1873, Catherine married William Henry Harrison Antrim in the First Presbyterian Church in Santa Fe. The McCarthy brothers both served as witnesses. Shortly after, they moved to Silver City, New Mexico, where Joseph McCarthy adopted the surname of his new father. Shortly after, on September 16, 1874, Catherine died of tuberculosis. Henry was 14, Joseph was 12. Sadly, as men seem to do, William abandoned the boys, leaving them orphaned. I can only assume because there was no longer a woman in the picture. Orphaned at just 15, Henry was offered a room in a boarding house in exchange for work by a woman called Sarah Brown. On September 16, 1875, he was caught stealing food. 10 days later after this, along with a boy named George Schaefer, he robbed a Chinese laundry, stealing clothing and 2 pistols. Charged with theft, Henry escaped and fled from New Mexico to southeast Arizona territory, becoming a fugitive. He managed to secure work as a ranch hand and he gambled away his wages at a nearby games house. This seemed to pay off though, as in 1876 he was recruited by well-known rancher Henry Hooker. You can tell he's important because there's a photo of him. During his time with Henry, he became acquainted with John R. Mackey, a Scottish-born criminal and former US cavalry private who, following his discharge, remained near his post in Camp Grant, Arizona. Together they began to steal horses from the soldiers, where they gave Henry his iconic Kid nickname, albeit it was not in the form that most of us are familiar with now. They called him Kid Antrim because of his youth, lack of a beard, slight build and personality. In fact, it was only 1877 he began to call himself William H. Bonney. Did you know it was only in the mid-20th century where we first discovered his birth name of McCarthy? Well, you do now. But for now, he was Henry McCarthy no more. This was Billy the Kid. On the 17th of August 1877,
Really?
was at a saloon in the village of Bonita.
Really?
He got into an argument with Francis P. Windy Cahill, a blacksmith who frequently bullied Billy and called him a pimp on more than one occasion. In return, Billy called him a son of a bitch, which, while I think completely reasonable and deserved, made Francis throw Billy to the floor, resulting in the two struggling for Billy's revolver. Billy won the struggle and shot Francis, mortally wounding him. Billy claimed that Billy had no choice. He had to use the equalizer. Don't ask why he's got a New York accent, that guy. The following day, Francis P. Cahill died. Billy fled, but then returned a few days later for some reason, which defeated the entire point of fleeing and also led him to getting captured by Miles Wood, the local Justice of the Peace, which is a nonsensical title, and whoever made it up was undereducated and quite frankly foolish. He was detained at Camp Grant guardhouse, but escaped before law enforcement arrived. Billy attempted to relive his old days by stealing a horse, but it was promptly taken from him by the Apache, leaving him to walk many miles to the nearest fort at Fort Stanton. Starving and near death, Billy took refuge in the house of Seven Rivers Warriors gang member John Jones, whose mother nursed him back to health. What kind of name is John Jones? That sounds like a name that Ford bloody Prefect would make. Anyway, after regaining his health, Billy went to Apache Chijo, where he joined a gang of cattle rustlers. These were people who'd steal cattle, often for profit. These specific cattle rustlers, though, exclusively stole cattle from magnate John Chisholm. After being spotted with the gang in Silver City, Billy's involvement was mentioned in a local newspaper. The Lincoln County War. To all my fellow Young Guns fans, this is where the events of the first film take place. After returning to New Mexico, Billy worked as a cowboy for English businessman and farmer John Tunstall. John and his business partner and lawyer Alexander McSween were opponents of an alliance formed by the Irish-American businessmen Lawrence Murphy, James Dolan and John Riley. The three men had wielded an economic and political hold over Lincoln County since the early 1870s, due in part to their ownership of a beef contract with nearby Fort Stanton and a well-patronised dry goods store in the town of Lincoln. In February 1878, John Tunstall owed money to James Dolan, $8,000 to be precise. James managed to obtain a court order and requested Sheriff William J. Brady to attach $40,000 worth of property and livestock. John put Billy in charge of 9 prime horses and told him to relocate them to his barn for safekeeping. Meanwhile, William Brady assembled a large posse to seize John's cattle. On the 18th of the same month, John learned of this posse and he rode out to intervene. A sub-posse had broken off from the main posse, so he went in pursuit of that one, I think. The Wikipedia article is quite confusing. Deputies Jesse Evans, Henry Hill, and one more whose name I can't remember rode in ahead of John. Henry ended up catching up with John. His men covered the land all the way up to Lincoln, while John's 9 horses and guns were only spread out across a narrow trail. Billy, who was riding in drag, alerted the others, which made the deputies begin to fire without warning. John's hands galloped off through the brush to a hilltop overlooking the trail, while he first stayed with his horses, then rode away, but was pursued by the 3 deputies. The 3 deputies all survived the confrontation. Historian Robert Tartley writes that maybe Tunstall surrendered or drew his sidearm to defend himself from deputies Morton, who I forgot to mention, Hill and Evans. Either way, the shooting began and Tunstall died instantly when hit by 2 rifle bullets, one in the chest and another that ripped through his brain. Supporters of John went on to claim that he was murdered in cold blood, while supporters of the House insisted that he'd been shot down while resisting arrest by a lawfully commissioned deputy sheriff of Lincoln County. John Tunstall was 24 years old. Maybe I should do a video on Tunstall. He seems like a cool guy, to be honest. After John's death, Billy and other ex-stable hand Dick Brewer, who you might know for his role in Young Guns 1, where he's played by Billy the Kid's stepbrother. The actor's stepbrother, I mean, not Billy the Kid. Joseph Antrim was his only brother, and he was both his biological brother and Deb when the film came out. Billy and Dick swore adifits, which is their fancy word for oath, against William Brady and those in his posse, obtaining murder warrants from the Lincoln County Justice of the Peace, John Wilson. On the 20th of February of the same year, though, while trying to arrest Brady, Billy and 2 other men riding with him were caught and arrested. However, Deputy U.S. Marshal Robert Weidman, a friend of Billy's, sent an attachment of soldiers to put Brady's prison guards behind bars and release Billy and Dick. Dick was also in jail, by the way. After his release, Billy joined the Lincoln County Regulators, which was a gang made by Dick Brewer. On March 9th, they captured Frank Baker and William Morton, both of whom were accused of murdering John Tunstall. The 2 ended up being killed after an alleged escape attempt. On April 1st the same year, the Regulators ambushed William Brady and his deputies, resulting in a shootout in which Billy was shot in the thigh, while William and Deputy George W. Hindman were killed. Unfortunately for them, death doesn't do April Fools. 3 days later, Buckshot Roberts and Dick Brewer were killed in a shootout at Blazer's Mill. Warrants were issued for several participants on both sides, and Bonney and 2 others were charged with killing Brady, Hindman and Roberts. The Battle of Lincoln. On the night of Sunday, July 14th, 1878, Alexander McSween and the Regulators, now a group of 50 to 60 men, went to Lincoln and stationed themselves among several buildings. Now you might be thinking, Palpatech, why were they helping Alexander McSween, who we all remember for being business partners with John Tunstall? Well, the answer is that McSween organised and financially supported the Regulators along with John Chisholm. He basically did what he did in Young Guns. At the McSween residence were Billy the Kid, Florencio Chavez, Jose Kobe, Frey Chavez, Y Chavez, Jim French, Harvey Morris, Tomo Folliard, and Yigino Salazar, among others. Another group led by Marvin Chavez and Doc Skurlock positioned themselves on the roof of a saloon. Now you might be thinking, but in Young Guns there is only one Chavez, so which one is the Chavez that the film Chavez is based off? The answer is Jose Kobe, Frey Chavez, Y Chavez. They did this just to annoy me and get me to say Jose Kobe, Frey Chavez, Y Chavez over and over. Anyway, Henry Newton Brown, Dick Smith and George Coe defended a nearby bunkhouse. As well, I forgot to mention that. Later that day, a large force hired by the Murphy-Dolan faction marched into Lincoln, led by newly appointed Sheriff George Pepin. For much of the first day, the 2 sides traded gunfire. 5 were wounded on the side of Murphy-Dolan faction, but the Regulators suffered no casualties. The next few days went by much the same. I found conflicting results as to whether or not there were any casualties. Some say there were none, some say that Pepin sent sharpshooters to kill McSween's defenders atop the saloon. However, his men retreated, and sniper Charles Crawford was shot and killed by Fernando Herrera. George sent a request for assistance to Colonel Nathan Dudley, commandant at nearby Fort Stanton. Nathan refused, but later showed up with troops, due to either reports from the locals or reports that a soldier had been injured. Now the clever will know that stationed at Fort Stanton was a cavalry regiment. This is because I told you that. The cavalry did short work of McSween's supporters, causing them all to flee, save for those in the homestead. However, in a clever move, Buck Powell and Deputy Sheriff Jack Long set the house on fire. They tried to flee but were gunned down as soon as they left the door. This included McSween, as he was gunned down by Robert W. Beckwith. However, Billy's revenge was swift, and he quickly shot W. Beckwith. After the deaths of many of the members of the gang, it now belongs to Billy the Kid and Jim French. After reassessing their situation, they fled the Adobe House, or the Adobe House, I don't know how to say that word. Figures of the family died vary, but at least 5 regulators died, and at least 2 members of the posse died. Aftermath. Billy and 3 other survivors of the battle were near the Mescalerio Indian Agency, where the agency bookkeeper Morris Bernstein was murdered on August 5th, 1878. All 4 were indicted of the murder, despite conflicting evidence that Bernstein had been killed by Constable Atanaccio Martinez. All these indications were later quashed, save for Billy's. On October 5th of the same year, Marshal John Sherman informed the newly appointed Territorial Governor and Union Army General Lee Wallace that he held warrants for several men, including William H. Antrim, alias Kid, alias Bonnie, which is way less cool than the beginning of Young Guns 2. Anyway, John went on to say that he was unable to execute them due to owning the disturbing condition of affairs in a county resulting in the acts of desperate class of men. Lee Wallace issued an amnesty proclamation on November 13, 1878, which pardoned anyone involved in the Lincoln County War since Tunstall's murder. It specifically excluded persons who had been convicted or indicted for a crime, and therefore excluded Billy. On February 18th of the following year, Billy and his friend Tom O'Folliard, whose name I enjoyed pronouncing more than I like to admit, were in Lincoln and watched as attorney Hudson Chapman was shot and his body set on fire. According to eyewitnesses, the pair were innocent bystanders forced at gunpoint by Jesse Evans to witness the event. Billy wrote to Governor Lee Wallace on March 13, 1879, with an offer to provide information on the Chapman murder in exchange for amnesty. On March 15th, Lee Wallace replied, agreeing to a secret meeting to discuss the situation. He met with Lee in Lincoln on March 17, 1879. During the meeting, and in subsequent correspondence, Lee promised Billy protection from his enemies and clemency if he would testify for a grand jury. On March 20th, Wallace wrote to Bonnie, to remove all suspicion of understanding, I think it better to put the arresting party in charge of Sheriff Kimbrell, who shall be instructed that no violence is to be used. They responded on the same day, agreeing to testify and confirming Lee's proposal to detain and arrest him to ensure his safety. On March 21st, he let himself be captured by a posse led by Sheriff George Kimball of Lincoln County. As agreed, Billy provided a small statement on the murder of Chapman and testified in court. However, the district attorney refused to set him free. Billy began to suspect that Lee Wallace had lied to him, causing him to escape prison on June 17, 1879. Wisely, Billy stayed out of trouble until January 10, 1880, where he shot and killed newcomers to the area, Joe Grant, at Hargrove Saloon in Fort Sumner. The Santa Fe Weekly New Mexican reported, Billy Barney, more extensively known as the Kid, shot and killed Joe Grant. The origin of the difficulty was not learned. According to other sources, Billy had been told that Grant intended to kill him. So he walked straight up to him and told him that he admired his gun and wished to hold it. Joe obliged, and Billy saw that the gun only had 3 bullets. After ensuring the hammer would fall upon an empty cartridge, Billy returned the gun. Immediately after, Joe attempted to shoot Billy, yet since the cartridge was empty, nothing came. Instead, Billy drew his own gun and shot him through his head. It was basically the whistling scene in Young Guns. A reporter for the Las Vegas Optic quoted Bonnie as saying that the encounter was a game of 2, and I got there first. Apology for the really bad American accents, by the way. Also in 1880, Billy met Jim Greathouse, who introduced him to Dave Rudabow. On November of the same year, Billy, Dave, and a guy named Billy Wilson ran from a posse led by Deputy Sheriff James Carlisle. This led to them being cornered at Jim's ranch. However, the 3 used this to their advantage, claiming that they were holding Jim hostage. James offered to trade places with Jim to negotiate, and Billy agreed. When he reached the barn and saw the rows, James tried escaping through a window, only to be shot 3 times and killed. The shootouts ended in a standoff, the posse withdrew, and Billy, Rudabow, and Wilson rode away. A few weeks later, Billy, Dave Rudabout, Billy Wilson, Tommy Folliard, Charlie Baldry, and Tom Pickett rode into Fort Sumner, where, unbeknownst to Billy, a posse led by none other than Pat Garrett was waiting for them. The posse opened fire, killing O'Folliard, but the others escaped. On December 13, 1880, Lee Wallace posted a $500 bounty for Billy's capture. Pat Garrett continued in his hunt for Billy, chasing the gang to a stone house in Stinking Springs, New Mexico. One morning, Charlie Baldry went out to feed the horses, only to be shot multiple times by Garrett and his posse. He fell back into the doorway, ready for death's embrace, only for Billy to encourage him. "Take a few of them with you when you die." At this, Charlie became excited once more, but he was riddled with bullets, and weak to the point where he couldn't pull the gun out of his holster. Apparently, in the last few seconds of his life, he stumbled towards Pat Garrett, repeating the phrase, "I wish, I wish." His remains were given to his wife, who buried him alongside Tommy Folliard. Now, fellow fans of Young Guns 2 will notice some parallels to, spoiler, Doc Scurlock's death. And you'd be right, because Young Guns' duology is surprisingly historically accurate. However, fun fact, Charlie Baldry married 23-year-old Manuela Herrera. She was sister of Maria Antonio Miguela Herrera, who married Doc Scurlock. Isn't the world just so cool? They're like brothers-in-law, you know? Anyway, following this, Pat managed to capture Billy along with Tom Pickett, Dave Rudabout, and Billy Wilson. The prisoners were shackled and taken to Fort Sumner, then Las Vegas and New Mexico, where they arrived on Boxing Day and were met by a crowd of curious onlookers. The following day, an armed mob gathered at the train depot before the prisoners and Pat Garrett departed for Santa Fe. Deputy Sheriff Romero, backed by the angry group of men, demanded custody of Dave Rudabout, who, during an unsuccessful escape attempt on April 5, 1880, shot and killed Deputy Antonio Lino Valdez in the process. Garrett refused, but tentatively let Romero come, where, at Santa Fe, he petitioned for Garrett to release Dave to him. In a later interview with a reporter, Billy said he was unafraid in the incident, saying, "If only I had my Winchester, I'd lick the whole crowd." Billy sent 4 letters to Lee Wallace seeking clemency, but Wallace refused, and Billy went on trial in April 1881 in Mesilla, New Mexico. Here, Billy was convicted for the murder of Sheriff William J. Brady. Billy was convicted for the murder of Sheriff William J. Brady. He was the only member of the Lincoln County Ward to be convicted for his crimes. On April 13th of the same year, Judge Warren Bristol sentenced him to death by hanging on the same day of the following month. Although author and poet Arthur Chapman wrote this famous It
is therefore considered by the court here that said defendant, William H. Bonney, alias Kidd, alias William Antrim, alias Henry McCarty, be confined in prison in said Lincoln County by the sheriff of such county until on the day aforesaid he be taken from such prison to a suitable and convenient place of execution within said county, and there be hanged by the neck till he be dead, dead, dead. Now, do you have anything to say, young man?
Yes, Your Honor, I do. You can go to hell, hell, hell.
In actuality, it's fictional, and Billy was reportedly silent after the reading of his sentencing. Quite grim for a man who told a reporter in response to a question on why he was looking so relaxed. "What's the look of looking on the gloomy side of everything? The laugh's on me this time." Following his sentencing, Billy was moved to Lincoln, where he was held under guard on the top floor of Town Courthouse. On the evening of April 28, 1881, Pat Garrett was out collecting taxes, and Deputy Bob Ollinger took 5 prisoners across the street to have a meal. This left Billy alone with a man named James Bell. Billy asked to go to the outhouse behind the courthouse, but unlike in Young Guns 2, there was no gun in the outhouse toilet. Billy, who was walking in front of James, slipped behind a corner. The hidden Billy slipped out of his handcuffs, presumably with his small hands, then beat James with his handcuffs. During the scuffle, Billy seized James' revolver, basically shooting him in the back as he tried to get away. Remarkably grimmer than the way he does it in Young Guns 2. No! I will stop talking about the Young Guns duology. I'll swear on it. I'll swear on it with such conviction. I am really convicted. I'm more convicted than Billy the Kid was of his crimes. Anyway, speaking of which, Billy was still shackled, so he broke into Pat Garrett's office and took a loaded shotgun, which was left behind by Bob Ollinger. He waited at the upstairs window for Ollinger to respond to the gunshot that killed Bell, and called out to him, "Look up, old boy, and see what you get." When Ollinger looked up, Billy shot and killed him. After about an hour, Billy freed himself with an axe instead of the powerful firearms at his disposal. Then, obtaining a horse, he rode out of Lincoln. According to some reports, he was singing as he left. I can only assume it was a sad tune. On the run once more, Lee Wallace put yet another $500 on Billy's head. 3 months later, Pat Garrett heard rumours that Billy was in Fort Sumner. He left Lincoln with 2 deputies on the 14th of July 1881 to question Pete Maxwell, a friend of Billy's. Pete and Pat spoke for several hours until midnight, when the two sat in Pete's dark bedroom. It was around here when Billy unexpectedly entered. Accounts vary as to the following course of events. According to the canonical version, he entered the room. Bonnie failed to recognise Garrett's leash before lighting, drawing his revolver, backing away, asking, Quien es? Which is Spanish for, who is it? Who is it? Recognising Bonnie's voice, Barrett drew his revolver and fired twice. The first bullet struck Bonnie in the chest just above his heart, while the second missed. He was only 21. A few hours later, the local justice of the peace assembled a coroner's jury of 6 people. The jury interviewed Pete and Pat, and the crime scene and Billy's body were both examined. The body was proven to be Billy's, and the grave was marked merely with a wooden marker. Dead? This isn't the end of the story. Rumours of Billy's survival spread like wildfire. People claimed that Garrett had let Billy live out of friendship, and some went as far to claim that they were, in fact, the kid. Most of these claims were easily disproven, but some still convince people to this day. It's a mystery we shall perhaps never solve, and the whole video in itself. I can tell you, however, that the body believed to be Billy the Kid was eventually moved to be with Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Bowdry, with a gravestone marked House. So there you have it, the life and times of Billy the Kid. Maybe you love him, maybe you hate him, maybe now you want to rewatch Young Guns for the 50th time. Whatever your thoughts, tell me in the comments. Was he a badass? Was he a bastard? Or was he mildly interesting? And until next time, remember...
Yoo-hoo! I'll make you famous.
After the reading of his sentence. Ah, my balls, Jesus Christ!